Welcome to online tutor training at GRCC. In this presentation, we are going to investigate the concept of learning styles. As tutors, you might already know that different students learn differently. The same tutoring approach might work with one student, but not the next. In order to be effective tutors, we need to be able to recognize these differences and accommodate them. Today, we'll examine some of the theory associated with learning styles and then see how we can apply this theory to our work. So what do we hope to learn today? First, we will define learning styles and then describe two well-known learning style models. Next, we will discuss the connections between learning styles and tutoring. After that, you will complete an assessment where you will identify learning and tutoring strategies based on an individual's learning style. And lastly, you will assess your own learning style by completing a questionnaire, and then you will evaluate the results of this questionnaire. Some of you have probably noticed that when trying to learn something new, you catch on quicker when you hear someone else talk about the topic or when you discuss the topic within a group. On the other hand, some of you probably prefer to read about a concept in order to learn it, while yet others need to experiment with or try things out before fully grasping a new idea. The manner in which a person prefers to learn is called his or her learning style. No learning style can be considered right or wrong or good or bad. An individual's learning style has nothing to do with his or her intelligence. Instead, learning styles involve the way a person's brain works to take in, process, organize, store, and recall information. Since every student learns differently than the next, understanding learning styles can help you become a better tutor. By investigating learning styles and completing this training, you will gain insight into how your tutees' brains learn best. This awareness will enable you and your tutees the chance to study more effectively. There are many well-known models which attempt to define learning styles. These models often vary widely in the dimensions that are defined as part of a learning style. Some models look at how we prefer to take in and process new information. Other models look at whether we prefer to study by ourselves or in a group. Still other models look at our preferences for our learning environments, such as lighting and noise levels. Believe it or not, there are even more models that incorporate all of the previously mentioned factors and more. Today, we are going to take a look at two well-known learning style models, Fleming's VARK model and Felder-Silverman's learning styles model. There are many learning style models that attempt to describe our preferences for taking in new information. Most of these models focus on how we take information in through our 5 bodily senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste. To illustrate the concept of information intake preferences, we are going to take a look at the VARK model, which was developed by Neil Fleming of Lincoln University in New Zealand. This model describes 4 different information intake modalities: visual, auditory, read/write, and kinesthetic. It is important to note that although each of us may have a preference for taking in new information through one of the aforementioned modalities, we all acquire information in more than one way. In fact, it is probably best to make a conscious effort to utilize all of the avenues of information intake while studying. Let's take a look at each of these 4 intake modalities. Visual learners learn best through seeing. That's why they're called visual learners. But this means more than just pictures. These students have a preference for information that is pictured in charts, graphs, diagrams, as well as illustrations. They also tend to use these types of visual representations when communicating with others. For example, when describing a past experience or situation, visual learners often talk about the color, size, and appearance of persons, places, and things. They often draw pictures in the air while talking and use other hand gestures in trying to give listeners a mental picture. Visual learners pay very close attention to font color, font type, and font markups such as underlines or italics when reading. These students often use different colors when taking notes. Additionally, their notes often contain doodles or drawings. When listening to someone speak, visual learners also notice nonverbal communication clues such as eye contact, facial expressions, and body posture. Auditory learners learn best through talking and listening. In a tutorial setting, these students are generally pretty easy to identify. While studying, these students have a tendency to read out loud and talk to themselves through problems and passages. These students often have an easy time following spoken directions and instructions. When listening to another person speak, auditory learners pay particularly close attention to details such as tone of voice, pitch, speed, and other such nuances. They are also acutely aware of and take meaning from a speaker's pronunciation and choice of words. In class, auditory learners listen for the instructor's voice inflection to tell them what is important. On the other hand, auditory learners often have a difficult time reading the body language or facial expressions of others. Read-write learners learn best through, you guessed it, reading and writing. They prefer information that is displayed in words as opposed to diagrams, illustrations, or charts. They are often able to express themselves well through their writing and are easy to pick out in a tutorial setting by their copious amount of course notes. In fact, they will most likely want to jot down notes while you are tutoring them. They will often use to-do lists to plan out and prioritize their daily activities. Kinesthetic learners learn best by touching, moving, and doing hands-on activities. They learn best through experience and practice and do not like watching others perform a task or listening to others describe how to perform a task. These students tend to learn better if they are allowed to be physically active while studying. For example, they like to be the one controlling the mouse when learning to use a computer. Kinesthetic learners also have the tendency to wiggle, tap their feet, and fidget while they sit through a tutoring session. If you're a kinesthetic learner, you might be doing this right now. Now that we have talked about the 4 different intake modalities, which do you think best describes your preferences? Are you visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or read-write? Now that we've taken a look at the VARK Learning Styles model, which focuses solely on information intake preferences, we are now going to investigate a model which describes 4 different aspects of learning styles. The Felder-Silverman Learning Styles model was developed by Dr. Richard M. Felder from North Carolina State University and Dr. Linda K. Silverman, founder of the Gifted Development Center in Colorado. As mentioned, this model describes 4 aspects of a person's learning style: the sensing versus intuitive dimension, the visual versus verbal dimension, the active versus reflective dimension, and the global versus sequential dimension. We will now look at each of these aspects in more detail. As we do so, think of each dimension as a continuum with one learning preference on the far left and the other learning preference on the far right. The sensing versus intuitive dimension looks at how students prefer to take in new information. Sensing learners favor information that comes in through the 5 bodily senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. These types of learners prefer dealing with facts, figures, and are detail-oriented. These learners prefer course content that has strong, real-world applications. They also do well in courses which require significant amounts of memorization. Intuitive learners, on the other hand, prefer internally generated information. They tend to enjoy daydreaming, abstract thought, and thinking of possibilities. These students tend to work faster, are often innovative, but sometimes overlook details. It is important to note that everyone is sensing at times and intuitive at others. Felder suggests trying to strike a balance between the 2 preferences by employing learning strategies that cater to both preferences. By doing so, you may learn that your learning style preferences change over time as you find success with other learning strategies. The visual versus verbal dimension looks at how students prefer information to be presented. Since our coverage of the VARK model has already tackled the concept of visual learners, we will briefly recap by stating that visual learners prefer visual representations of course content. These students prefer information to be presented in charts, diagrams, pictures, and illustrations. On the other hand, verbal learners prefer written and spoken presentations. They are often avid readers and tend to prefer to study in groups and benefit from listening and discussing within these groups. The verbal learner category can be thought of as a combination of the auditory and read-write categories from the VARK model. The active versus reflective dimension looks at how learners prefer to process new information. Active learners prefer a hands-on approach to the learning process. These students like to try things out and, by doing so, figure out how they work. An active learner might disregard the instruction manuals when attempting to operate or put together a new purchase. These learners tend to prefer group work and group discussion in class and while studying. On the other hand, reflective learners prefer to think things through before acting. They are likely to closely study the instruction manual when buying something new. These students tend to prefer to study alone and generally prefer quiet places to do homework and study. The global versus sequential dimension looks at how learners prefer to organize new information. Global learners organize information in a holistic fashion and seem to comprehend new material in large chunks. These students think deductively by first working to understand the big picture and then, using their understanding of the connectivity of the parts, these learners then focus on the specifics. When working with global learners, you may notice that they seem to learn slowly at first, but once they grasp a topic, they often see connections missed by sequential learners. Sequential learners process information in a step-by-step, sequential, and linear fashion. These students think inductively by first working to understand the specifics of a topic and then putting these parts together to understand the whole. When working with sequential learners, you may notice that they seem to learn quickly at first, but often have difficulty later on in putting the information in context and understanding the big picture. Once a student has identified his or her learning style, the student can then begin to identify appropriate learning strategies. Tutors should be aware of the different study techniques and tips based on the various learning styles. As a part of this training, you will be asked to review and reflect on a document which lists a variety of study tips. As we work with students, it is very important to realize that we are all inherently biased in that we have a natural tendency to tutor students in the ways we learn best. To overcome this hurdle, we need to understand ourselves and the ways that we prefer to learn. By knowing our own learning style preferences, we become much more self-aware, which enables us to more effectively monitor our tutoring approach. By helping students identify studying techniques that accommodate their learning styles, you will generally find your students become more engaged and interested in covering the content. Student engagement and genuine interest often lead to student success. However, matching the presentation and approach to a student's learning style might not always be the best way to help them. Some topics are best understood through hands-on work, some are easier to understand through lectures, and some are more efficiently mastered through group discussions. For example, when studying to become a surgeon, it probably makes more sense to practice than to read about it in a book. Therefore, it is important that students learn to bring their own learning styles into balance. It is important to be able to take in, process, organize, and recall information using approaches for all learning styles because the content sometimes dictates which approach should be used. Further, studies have shown that multimodal learning using more than one approach enhances memory, and enhanced memory often leads to student success. By training ourselves to feel more comfortable with different intake modalities, we in turn become better students. As we experience success with a new studying technique which is outside our learning style's comfort zone, we begin to build confidence, which in turn causes our learning style preferences to change. Finally, studies have shown that students who engage in metacognition, which is the process of thinking about one's own thinking, are generally more successful in learning. Just merely having a conversation about learning styles and perhaps asking students to complete a learning styles questionnaire may help them understand themselves a little better and lead to student success. We hope this training has been useful and somewhat interesting for you. If, in the future, you have questions or would like some advice, be sure to ask your supervisor. Please turn in your responses to the corresponding assessment. Thank you for your time and attention. For a list of references, please consult with your supervisor.